Hello there, United States history students of Upper Arlington High School. I certainly hope you are having a wonderful day. This is my recorded slideshow lecture on the Populists and the Progressives. I'm your history teacher, Mr. Endres. Let's begin. Let's learn something. The Populists and the Progressives were both groups of people that wanted to address the inequality of people in American society. After the Second Industrial Revolution in United States history and the rise of very wealthy and powerful individuals, we're thinking of guys like John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie. There was both massive industrial development, massive urbanization, a lot of people moving from the countryside where there were once farmers, into the cities where there was more employment in factories. The late 19th century was certainly a time of incredible innovation and development. You had skyscrapers being built in the cities, railroads being laid down connecting the country. You had electricity, the electric light bulb, the telephone. When you get to the early 20th century, the car, the telephone, the phonograph. All of these things are obviously transforming American life. And it's easy to argue how so many of these new developments are going to be good. At least most people in the 21st century today look at these developments as good, as developing society and civilization. But of course, they came at a cost. There was a lot of human labor that went into the production of these things. And for many of the people who moved from the countryside into the cities, who were seeking new employment, their lives weren't the best. They were paid very little. They lived in squalid conditions. There were problems in the cities. There was alcoholism. There were gangs. And in the countryside, things weren't all that great either. Many farmers felt like they were getting ripped off by the railroads upon which they were dependent to ship their goods. And they too were struggling. So you have the masses of these hardworking, struggling Americans, and we find this incredible wage gap between the poor and the wealthy, because there are these astronomically wealthy people, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Morgan, and the like. And it was this inequality that played a significant role in sparking the movement of both the progressives, who were mostly in the city, and the populists, who were mostly in the countryside. Now, the way wealth was distributed in the late 19th century, that was part of the inspiration for the populists and progressives. But it certainly wasn't the only thing. There were gender issues. There were religious issues. There were environmental issues. There were issues that related to sanitation, food, and health. There were a whole bundle of things that the populists in the countryside and the progressives in the city saw as being problematic to modern American life, and they wanted to change these things. And so they fought in a wide variety of ways that we'll learn about. And really, that's the heart of this lecture. In the late 19th and early 20th century, the populists and the progressives were individuals who were fighting to create a better America, to sort of change the direction in which America was going at the time, to create a better America for more people, not just the wealthy. And the story of the populists and the progressives is pretty cool because you've got these different people. They're all fighters, but they come from different backgrounds. We've got both male and female. And you might find some that you really like, and you'll find others that you're like, they're okay. But they are all people who were successful in slightly changing the trajectory of United States history and working hard to create an America that would be more enjoyable, more healthy for more people. All right, so let's learn about them. If you could travel back in time to the late 19th century, and you could go to one of the big burgeoning cities like Chicago or New York, you would find in a day and age before the development of the car, many people crowded together, many of them immigrants. So you have a wide variety of cultures and languages. If you could travel back to the year 1900 and go to New York City, you would hear a variety of different languages being spoken in New York City. I guess you still do today. That's not uncommon. It's one of the most cosmopolitan cities in the world. In the year 1900, 20% of New Yorkers did not speak English. They immigrated to the United States, they came to New York City, and they found particular neighborhoods in New York City where the people there were of their same heritage and spoke their language. It was an incredible melting pot of a city where not everything was getting melted. There was a lot of cultural diversity. Big cities are exciting places for just this reason. There was a lot of cultural diversity, but there was also a significant amount of poverty. When there was mass immigration that came into New York City, Chicago, and the other big booming cities, you can also think of Pittsburgh as a city that grew by leaps and bounds at this time too, in the late 19th century. When you had this mass of people coming into these cities, they're obviously going to need a place to stay. So for those more wealthy individuals who had the capital, they would build these apartments where the immigrants could live, and they could charge them rent, and they could make a lot of money off of these immigrants. Now, for these landlords who had the ability to build the apartments, they're going to build these apartments as cheaply as they possibly can. That way, when they get tenants into their apartments and they charge them rent, the less they've spent on the actual construction on the apartment, the more money they can make from the rent. So these cheaply built apartments were known as tenements. So again, for the companies that built the tenements and for the landlords that owned and rented out the tenements, their primary focus is on making money. This isn't to say that they don't care about the health and the welfare of their tenants, but when it comes to providing electricity, decent plumbing, secure fire escapes, there was certainly a motive for the companies that built the tenements and the landlords to maybe trim the costs a little bit by not worrying about taking care of those things with the best material, or in some cases even providing them at all. Yeah, so you can understand how for some of these immigrants and other poor people coming to live into the tenements, life might be difficult. And of course, for their end, they might try to save money by squeezing as many people as possible into a tenement. So an apartment that was built for maybe one family might hold three, and everybody just sort of squeezed together. And that too can create an unsanitary environment that also might be difficult to live in for social and emotional reasons. So okay, as I describe this, hopefully you can see some problems. Unsafe living conditions. That's not good. But how do you change it? Who has the motive to change it? Well, what we find in the late 19th, early 20th century with the movement of both the Populists and the Progressives is a sense that the government needs to get involved here. The landlords and the construction workers have no motive, or certainly no financial motive at least, to provide the healthiest, safest apartment for the families that they're renting out to. So the only thing that might be able to provide them with the inspiration to have to make sure that there's, good fire escapes, for example, would be for government to pass laws that say, okay, a fire escape has to meet this code, it has to be built out of this material, there has to be adequate ventilation for the people living there, and so on and so forth. And this is the story of the Populists and the Progressives. Throughout most of American history, the government, especially the federal government in Washington, D.C., has been relatively small. Their job was to fund the military to protect our countries and to deliver the mail. But now, after the Second Industrial Revolution of the late 19th century and the emergence of these really strong and powerful, wealthy individuals, by the time you get to the late 19th century, rich capitalists are running the country. It's almost like a new form of aristocracy. And the Populists and the Progressives, they believed if we're going to maintain a democracy and not just let the rich people run the country, then the only institution that's strong enough and powerful enough to keep the wealthy and their corporations in check and to protect the people is the United States government. New laws must be created, and those laws must be enforced. All right, so that's the whole spirit of populism and progressivism. So let's go back to the cities. Here's another image of the tenements, if you are able to look at your screen right now. Here's a famous picture of an immigrant family living in a tenement. Probably looks slightly different from your home. Here's another image of a woman and a child in a tenement. Looks like there's laundry hanging up. One of the ways if you wanted to make some additional money in your tenement, if you could, is you could take in your neighbor's laundry and do your neighbor's laundry for them. All right, and here's another very interesting image. Here are some people at work in some sort of rudimentary factory. Maybe it's a bottle making factory. Take a look at who these people are, and specifically how old they are. Let's take a look at this. Here's a textile factory, and you can tell quite clearly here that the people working there are mostly children and young children. Now today when you think of what children do with their time, you think, well, kids don't go to work, they go to school. So why in the late 19th, early 20th century do we have children working rather difficult jobs in factories? Well, the answer to this is very simple: money. If you're the child of a poor family living in a tenement and it's not required that you go to school, then you can go get a job, bring home some money, and help your family out. So money. And on the other end of things, there are the employers. There's the owner and the managers of this textile mill, for example. Why would they hire a 10-year-old instead of a 20-year-old? Well, for them too, money. So long as this is a job that a child can do, you can pay a child less. Hey, you're just a kid. You don't have a family to take care of. You don't have rent to pay. So whereas we might give 50 cents a day to an adult to do this job, we're only going to give you 5 cents a day. And so that's good financially for the owners and the managers of the factories as well. It might be bad for the adults who could really use this job, but financially, this seems to make sense. So what's bad about child labor? As you see these pictures, if you're able to look at the pictures, and as you hear about this, you might be struck by the sense that, well, this is just wrong. A 10-year-old shouldn't be in a factory. A 10-year-old should be at school and playing with friends. Yes, a 10-year-old can still do work, but that work should be on the side. Really, a child should have the opportunity to be a child. And then furthermore, thinking of the future of our democracy, what would our country be like if most of the children didn't receive a basic education because they spent most of their childhood in a factory? What would the long-term impact on our country be? But if you feel that child labor is wrong, and then it must be eradicated, and those jobs should only be provided to adults, even if you reach that conclusion, you've got to ask yourself, well, how does it change? How does it change? There's both financial motivation for the child and the child's family, and for the employer. So how do you fight that? And once again, for the populists and the progressives, they feel that the government is going to have to get involved. That's the only way things are going to change. You simply have laws that say children are not allowed to work in most professions until they reach a particular age. In our country's history, child labor is not seriously restricted until the year 1938, near the end of the Great Depression. And likely those laws were passed at that point of time in history, not necessarily to protect the well-being of the child, but to protect the jobs for the adults. But there were movement to protect children and adults for humanitarian reasons in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. There was a large national movement, religious in nature, to provide help and opportunity and direct assistance to the poor. This was called the social gospel movement. The social gospel movement, as its name implies, was religious, and specifically, it was based upon some of the most fundamental teachings of Jesus. The social gospel movement spread throughout the United States in most, but certainly not all churches, encouraging the Christians of the United States to help those that were less fortunate than them. Because they said, quite simply, this is what it means to be a Christian: to love your neighbor, to care for people. So in the churches that were part of the social gospel movement, congregations would hear about the plight of children and the poor, and they would organize themselves to help those people to improve their lives in a lasting and meaningful way. The father of the social gospel movement was this man, Washington Gladden. Gladden was a minister who helped to organize these movements in various churches across the United States of America. He tried to fight political corruption. He advocated on behalf of unions, really tried to communicate to the millions of people who identified themselves as Christian in the United States of America that it was truly their Christian duty to help the poor of the United States of America, of which there were many. Now, one other fun fact about Washington Gladden is his hometown was Columbus, Ohio, and Columbus served as his operational base throughout most of his career. For Gladden, this was his calling. He believed that if every Christian in the United States of America would simply follow the basic Christian principle to love thy neighbor as thyself, then all of these problems associated with poverty would very, very quickly disappear. Gladden was the man who kicked this all off, but not many people remember Washington Gladden today. He's not the big name of the social gospel movement. The biggest name of the social gospel movement is this woman, Jane Addams. Jane Addams was one of the most innovative and successful women in all of American history. She is the first female American to win the Nobel Peace Prize. In her lifetime, she would have been a force to be reckoned with. Here's what Jane Addams did. Jane Addams' primary concern were the urban, homeless children in her hometown of Chicago, Illinois. If you are a kid, if you are homeless, then several things are going to happen to you. First of all, you're going to need to survive. So you're probably going to get involved in a life of crime at a very young age. You have to in order to eat. And then what's this going to do to you as you become a criminal at an early age? Maybe you're in and out of jail. What's it do to your social and emotional health if you don't have a home to go to or parents to care for you? That concerned Jane Addams, and here's what she decided to do about it. She created this. This is Hull House in Chicago. Hull House would be a refuge for homeless and orphaned children. It's a place where they could come to eat, sleep, and live. It's a place where they could get educated. It's a place where they could learn how to be healthy. It's a place where they could learn skills. It's a place where they could come and live to be part of a family and to feel loved and cared for and protected and to have an opportunity to be a normal, healthy, successful, financially stable adult. Now, how do you think Jane Addams did all this? Specifically, where'd she get the money to do all this? This is a lot of money we're talking about here. First of all, just to buy Hull House, which is a big building in downtown Chicago, and then buying the food, paying the workers. Where's she going to get all of this money from? Well, this is part of the social gospel movement. Jane Addams is going to go from church to church to church to church. You call yourselves good Christians? How could you call yourselves good Christians when there are children who are sleeping tonight on the street with empty bellies while you sleep in a comfortable bed with a belly full of food? What would Jesus do? Jane Addams went from church to church to church. She found patrons. She created Hull House. And let's learn about a few of the things that Hull House provided. Hull House was the first social settlement of its kind in Chicago. Hull House provided the first public kindergarten. Hull House provided the first public playground in the city of Chicago. Hull House provided the first public gymnasium in the city of Chicago. Hull House provided the first public kitchen in the city of Chicago, where people could go to get free food if they were hungry. Hull House provided the first little theater in the United States of America. Hull House provided the first Boy Scout troop in the city of Chicago. Hull House provided the first free art exhibit in Chicago. Hull House provided the first free citizen preparation classes. So if you were an immigrant coming into Chicago and you wanted to become an American citizen, Hull House would help teach you English and how to pass the citizenship test. Is this all? No, it keeps going. Hull House provided the first college extension courses in Chicago. Hull House provided the first infant care facility in a Chicago high school. So in other words, if you were a high school girl and you had a baby, Hull House would look after your baby while you went to high school to finish high school and get your degree. Hull House provided the first private venture capital fund in the United States of America targeted towards neighborhood development or neighborhood business development. So hey, Jane Addams is also a venture capitalist as well, organizing people with money to invest in local businesses. Hull House provided the first domestic violence court advocacy program in Chicago. So in other words, if you were the victim or survivor of domestic abuse, Hull House would help provide you with a lawyer. Hull House also employed healthcare workers to take care of the people who lived there. Hull House was the first settlement program in the nation that worked to keep orphaned children together in a foster care family. She did all that. Jane Addams, a great American, and hopefully it's very clear why she was the first female recipient for the Nobel Peace Prize. She was also a strong advocate for women getting the right to vote, and she was also a strong pacifist who did not support America's entry into the First World War. Now, this was well over 100 years ago when Hull House was founded. A lot's changed in American society over the course of the 20th and into the 21st century. What do you think? Do we still need a Hull House today or something like it here in Columbus or in any major city in the United States of America? Or are all kids taken care of today and everything's great? We don't need anything like a settlement house, like Hull House. What do you think? Do you think Hull House is still around today? If you go to Chicago today, can you visit Hull House? Hull House? Well, not really. Hull House eventually closed its doors, but only recently. Hull House closed down in 2012. And why? Why did it close down? Was it because the kids of Chicago are all taken care of? No, not at all. It closed because it was unable to collect money. It closed for financial reasons. Now, you still can visit Hull House today, sort of. It's a museum. And a museum is great for those of us who love history, but a museum is limited in its ability to provide direct help to the poor children of Chicago or anywhere. Okay, so that's Chicago. What about Columbus, Ohio, our hometown? I mean, after all, the social gospel movement started here with Washington Gladden. Did anything happen here? Is there anything ongoing here that dates back to the late 19th century? Well, yes, there is. There is a nonprofit organization which provides assistance to those in need. Today, it's called Life Care Alliance. It's gone through several name changes throughout the course of, well over 100 years. But today it's called Life Care Alliance. It was established here in Columbus, Ohio in 1898. It has done so much and continues to do a lot for a wide variety of people. It helps make Columbus a great place to be. And furthermore, it's developed several creative ways to generate income. It does not rely exclusively upon donations so that it doesn't suffer the same fate as Hull House. If you're inspired by the social gospel movement and the story of Jane Addams, it might be worth looking up Life Care Alliance, even contacting them. They've got a wide variety of volunteer opportunities, even for teenagers. And then when I think of Columbus, Ohio, this is a far more recent establishment, but not too recent. It goes back, I think, 40 years or so. Huckleberry House, which is a home in Columbus, which any child can go to if they have run away from their own home, or if they are homeless, or if they are in any way in fear of their safety. And these are examples of the social gospel movement that began in the late 19th century in response to an industrializing, urbanizing modern America and all of the problems that came along with that. Now, the social gospel movement started in the cities, but it spread to the countryside as well. Obviously, the concerns of what's going on in rural America, very different from what's going on in urban America, but the spirit of organizing and helping people in need is there. And this will eventually develop in the countryside into what we call the populist movement. And the populist movement becomes a political movement, but it goes through quite a bit of evolutionary change before it becomes a political movement. Let's learn about that now. Okay, so let's talk about farmers of the late 19th century, and specifically the plight of farmers in the late 19th century. Now, to a certain degree, farmers were a victim of their own success. Farming methods had become so efficient by the late 19th century, and food production was so good that drove the price of food down. But the real problem for the farmers in the late 19th century were the owners of the railroads and the prices that they set for shipping food across the United States of America. Many farmers felt that they were getting ripped off. For many farmers, their fight is going to be against the railroads and their owners and the wealthy railroad barons that control them, the Jay Goulds, the Cornelius Vanderbilts, the J.P. Morgans. This is the story of the populist movement and how the populist movement came to be. It's an interesting story with an interesting background. Here's a photograph that I found of a farming family from the plains at the end of the 19th century. I was trying to find a photograph that would capture the image of what rural life in central and the central part of the United States would have looked like in the late 19th century. So here you have a family on their farm with their animals and nothing else around for probably miles, except for their farmland. Now, this picture is kind of interesting because this family is posing next to an organ. It's kind of a cool organ, if you ask me. I don't know what the purpose of this photograph is. It's kind of an interesting one. But anyways, my purpose wasn't to try to capture a beautiful musical instrument in the middle of a farm. It was trying to capture, my point was to try to capture how just isolated this family was. So in the year 1866, let's start there. This is the beginning of the whole movement. The Secretary of Agriculture, Oliver Kelly, was concerned about the farmers. Now, this is 4 years into the Homestead movement. Oliver Kelly was the Secretary of Agriculture under President Abraham Lincoln. It's 1866, so this is during the Andrew Johnson years. We've now got homesteaders spreading out into the plains. And Kelly has a concern for the farmers at this time. Now, let's remember, this is a member of the presidential cabinet. He's a member of the federal government. So this is what makes this movement very interesting. It actually starts with an action in Washington, D.C. So just kind of keep that in mind. So Kelly looks at the farmers, the rural farmers throughout the United States of America, and he is concerned about them. And his concern is their social and emotional development, living with little human interaction outside of the family. That's his primary concern. What happens to you if you live for possibly years on end with minimal contact with the rest of society? Now, Kelly, as a member of the presidential cabinet, he thought that this might be detrimental in the long term to the United States of America. Without much social interaction, he felt that these farmers, who are good people who are making our food, might become increasingly ignorant and prejudiced, and that would make them the best citizens, and the United States as a whole might suffer. So Kelly helped to create an organization dedicated to providing farmers throughout the United States of America with both a social life and education. He wants to keep farmers socially connected. And this organization, subsidized by the United States federal government, was called the Grange. The Grange was the first national farmers organization. And the Grange did a couple of things. First of all, it provided money for social gatherings for farmers around the United States of America. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about social gatherings, parties, social events where the farmers and their families can show up to and interact with other farmers. Now, I have this particular image here, if you're looking at your screen. This is a party, this is a dance. It is a social gathering for the teenage children of farmers. So then if you're a teenager, you're likely doing quite a bit of farming yourself at this point in time in your life. But growing up on a farm prior to the development of telephones, radios, televisions, any of that stuff, you're going to have very limited social interaction with other people your age. So these dances would be held so that you get to meet other people, get to know other people, and, probably maybe even fall in love. Now that's for the teens. Now for the adults, what happens in these social gatherings will change the course of American history. When these farmers get together, what do you think they're going to talk about? Well, they're going to talk about farming. And as they talk about farming, it's not going to take too long before they start complaining. And what are they going to start complaining about? Naturally, the railroads, and how the railroads are ripping them off. And as these farmers make this social connection and realize they have a common enemy, well, they decide they could form a team to fight their common enemy. They could essentially form a farmers' union, and they could collectively protest the high prices that the railroads are charging them to ship their goods. So the Grange started off as a political organization. And I mentioned the parties. The one thing I didn't mention is the other thing that the Grange started doing. The federal government was subsidizing newspapers. So there were journals associated with the Grange. So that way you could read about other farmers and what all was going on throughout your county, state, maybe nation. And that way you're a little bit better informed. And the United States federal government has created all of this under the Department of Agriculture. But now with the farmers using the Grange and the social gatherings of the Grange to create a union, well, this was not part of the plan of the federal government, and the federal government is not allowed to support a union. It is illegal for the United States government to create a union. However, Oliver Kelly's The Grange provided these farmers with the opportunity to form a union. So once the union is formed, it can't be called the Grange. It's got to be something else. What the Grange did was give birth to a wide variety of what is called farmers' alliances. There were several farmers' alliances throughout the United States of America. So from here on out, I won't talk about the Grange. I will now talk about the Farmers Alliance as sort of a collective whole. And the Farmers Alliance did the exact same thing. They had newspapers, they had get-togethers, but here the purpose is political. What the Farmers Alliance wants to do is get people together, endorse specific political candidates to run for office to pass legislation to protect the farmers and the farmers' interest, and also potentially to go on strike to fight the power of the railroads. So here's a picture I found of a gathering of a farmers' alliance in the late 19th century. I have no clue what they're doing here. Maybe playing some sort of game. All right. Now these farmers who formed the Farmers Alliance tended to be white, Protestant Christian, and socially conservative. So the Farmers Alliance tended to be exclusive. They tended not to allow into their membership African Americans, Catholics, or Jews. So in Texas, in the year 1890, a Colored Farmers National Alliance was created. And they acquired a membership of 1 million African American farmers. That's a substantial number. All of the other Farmers Alliance movements together were 1.5 million people. So you've got an organization that, in all of its varieties, has the support of 2.5 million Americans. That number of people organized can put substantial political pressure onto their local, state, and even federal governments. By that same year, 1890, the farmers of the Farmers Alliance are staying organized and informed through the circulation of 1,000 newspapers. And you also have 40,000 traveling lecturers that go from town to town to town to town, both educating and inspiring the farmers to continue to fight. Of these lecturers, the most famous was Mary Elizabeth Lease. She was a tall, elegant, fiery speaker, famous for her phrase, "You farmers need to be raising less corn and more hell." She espoused the growing doctrine of the new political movement that the Farmers Alliance was growing into. She began proclaiming that the United States of America was not, in practice, a democracy, but rather the United States was run by an aristocratic group of rich capitalists, and that the majority of Americans were not represented. As Mary Elizabeth Lease said in her own words, "Wall Street owns the country. It is no longer a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, but a government of Wall Street, by Wall Street, and for Wall Street." So we start off with the Grange, a social organization subsidized by the United States federal government. It evolves into a union, the Farmers Alliance, and now it evolves into a political party. This political party had an aim, just like we have Republicans and Democrats. This is the People's Party. And in 1892, they have their own candidate for President of the United States of America. Now, since the 1860 election, we've had two primary political parties in the United States of America, two big political parties, and you know what they are, the Democrats and the Republicans. Occasionally it happens that a popular third party shows up, and 1892 is one of these elections. 1912 will also be one of those elections. To a certain degree, 1992 will be one of those elections where a third party candidate shows up and is a major player in the presidential election. And there's always this curiosity. Could it happen in American history, like it happened so much in early 19th century American history, where a new political party will form and knock out one of the traditional political parties? Could the Republican Party or the Democratic Party fade away into obscurity and a new political party rise up to take their place? So in 1892, representing mostly rural farmers, you had the People's Party. That was the name of the political party. Informally, they were simply referred to as, and it's what I refer to, and it's what I've been calling them throughout all of this, the Populists. When we think of Populists, we need to think of the group of individuals who support the People's Party politically, and they support the economic and social issues of the majority of Americans who live outside of the cities. They tend to draw their support from rural America, and they tend to be traditional and religious. And when I mean traditional, I mean socially traditional, socially conservative. All right, so in the year 1892, James B. Weaver is the candidate for the People's Party. He obviously did not become president. We have not had a President Weaver, but he did win 4 states: Kansas, Colorado, Idaho, and Nevada. But Weaver didn't win enough to become president of the United States. In 1892, from New York, Grover Cleveland, the Democrat, he won the 1892 election. And after 1892, we don't talk about the People's Party anymore. So what happened to the People's Party? Well, it fused with the Democratic Party. Now, the Democrats didn't represent all of the interests of the People's Party. The Democratic Party being bigger or representing more people, they had to do just that. They had to represent the interest of a wide variety of people. So not just rural farmers, but also, at this point in time in history, the immigrants coming into the big city, a lot of the poor of the big cities, and then also, strangely, white Southerners who supported a segregated Jim Crow South. Now, in the following election, in 1896, the individual who would emerge as the Democratic candidate for the presidency was himself a populist. He came from rural America. His name was William Jennings Bryan. He was from Kansas. He was an extraordinarily popular candidate who represented the farmers of the various farmers' alliances. He supported unions. He believed in protecting the welfare and the health of urban workers, especially factory workers. He presented himself as the enemy of the rich entrepreneurial capitalist, guys like J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller. He wanted to pass legislation that would curb their power and protect the health and the livelihood of the average American worker. In his personal life, he was very Christian, socially conservative, famously skeptical of science, and we'll learn more about this when we get to the 1920s. He believed that Charles Darwin's theory of evolution was a threat to society. The other thing that William Jennings Bryan believed in politically that I forgot to mention was he believed in getting rid of the gold standard. So at this point in time in history, the amount of money that the United States of America could produce, so like dollar bills, how much money we could produce, was based upon the amount of gold that we had. And he believed that, and a lot of farmers and poor people believed, that it was in the power of the federal government to help generate more wealth for more people if we got rid of the gold standard and expanded the mineral foundation of our nation's economy from not just gold, but also to be gold and silver. So if gold and silver were the foundation for our nation's economy, then more money could be produced, more people would have money, and that would be good. In the early 1890s, there was also there was another stock market crash and an economic recession. And so by the time you get to the 1896 election, there was a loud cry to get rid of the gold standard. All right, so that was William Jennings Bryan, a very popular candidate for the presidency in 1896. His opponent was the Republican William McKinley. McKinley is from Canton, Ohio, up in northeastern Ohio, and he was our Republican. Now, the 1896 election was one of the most significant elections in American history because of how both of these men campaigned. William Jennings Bryan sets the precedent for the modern election, or rather I guess I should say, for the modern campaign strategy. What candidates do today is what William Jennings Bryan started to do in the 1896 election, which is travel all over the United States of America, hit as many places as he could, be face to face with as many people as possible, and give speech after speech after speech. And William Jennings Bryan was a very popular orator. He really could fire you up. He could really make you hate the rich people and want to vote for him, William Jennings Bryan, and create a new America where you didn't have this handful of rich people, but rather essentially wealth redistribution and more average Americans having greater wealth. And while William Jennings Bryan barnstormed all over the United States of America doing this whistle-stop campaign tour, William McKinley did the exact opposite. He famously stayed at his home in Canton, Ohio. He let the journalists come to him. He would give a few speeches from his front porch, and that would be it. But while he did that, those wealthy industrialists, Carnegie, Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, they financed William McKinley's campaign because William McKinley wasn't going to do anything to disrupt their ability to acquire wealth. So the wealthy did things like buying a significant number of ads in journals to promote William McKinley, to denigrate William Jennings Bryan, sometimes bribing reporters to cast Bryan in a negative light and McKinley in a positive light. And then also, very powerfully, there was the financial threat. Some of the industrialists had some of the managers of their factories tell their workers, if William Jennings Bryan becomes the next president of the United States of America, it'll create a new economic situation. We'll have to close down the mill, and you're out of a job. So it is in your best interest to vote for McKinley. And then on top of that, the elections in 1896 weren't necessarily secret ballot elections. So today when you go to vote, you are ushered to a voting booth, and you are able to, in private, select who you want and the legislation you want passed, and etc. You do this all in private. But how the elections were set up in 1896 were like this. When you show up to the polling station, if you wanted to vote for the Democrat, you got on this side of the room. If you wanted to vote for the Republican, you lined up on the other side of the room so that everybody could see who you were voting for when you went to the ballot box. So that was the situation. And in several cases, some of the factory owners and some of the management of the factories that represented the interests of big business, and these individuals had told you you should vote for McKinley, they stayed in the polling station and observed what was happening in the polling station. So when you went in to vote, there was your boss, and your boss could see who you were going to vote for. So that was the situation in 1896. And in 1896, William McKinley was elected the next president of the United States of America. He was our 25th president and the sixth of 8 presidents who have come from Ohio. So after 1896, and especially the 1896 election, there is a strong sense that politically and socially, the situation hasn't changed much. There are movements that are happening to change the political and economic structure of the United States of America, to make things more safe and more equal. But the populist movement, which culminated in the 1896 election, ultimately failed. Now, the Democratic Party has absorbed some of the ideas of the populist movement, and that will influence future Democratic leaders that we will learn about. But for now, in this lecture, I'm going to shift the focus from the populist movement that's happening in rural America to the progressive movement, which is happening in urban America. So the progressives were a wide variety of individuals from a wide variety of backgrounds who all believed in fighting for strengthening the power of the federal government to regulate businesses and protect the health and the financial stability of the people. Now, this is very similar to the populist movement. However, the progressives tended to be located more, but not exclusively, in the cities. And that made it culturally different. I mean, the progressives were called themselves the progressives because they believed in the forward movement of society. Populists tended to be a little bit more traditional and conservative, so they had different social views. And then also the progressives, and I guess this goes along with this, they tended to be more based upon science and the collection of evidence and the reporting of facts than based on religious tradition or a sense of religious duty. So we're going to learn about a wide variety of progressives, and the first is a group of progressives and a particular term that comes out of this era, and that term is the muckrakers. All right, what's a muckraker? A muckraker is a term that's used to describe an investigative journalist of this particular era who exposes corruption, exploitation, and scandal. And they do this usually in this lurid way to make their readers disgusted and angry and to force politicians to make legislative changes to improve lives for people. Now, in my definition of muckraker, I did say specifically people from this era, and I focus on this era because, well, that's what we're learning about right now. The term muckraker has been used to apply, has been applied to people throughout American history since the late 19th century, including today. But I'm going to focus on this point of time, this particular time in history. We're talking late 19th, early 20th century, when muckraking became a popular phrase. And the most popular muckraking magazine in the late 19th, early 20th century was this magazine. It was called McClures. Now, I believe McClures Magazine is still around today. However, I think its format has changed significantly, and it is no longer a muckraking magazine. But McClures was very popular. So think about this. We're talking early 20th century. We don't have radio yet. Radio doesn't come around until the 1920s. We don't have television until the 1950s. Movie houses will come around in the 19-teens. But in terms of entertainment within your own home, most people still rely upon the printed word. So newspapers and magazines were popular, and McClures was one of the most popular. Being a journalist on the staff of McClures would have been the pinnacle of any journalist's career. And this monthly magazine would report on all the shady things that were going on behind the closed doors of big businesses, the abuse of workers, the bribes that were paid to politicians, and all of these shady activities that when you read these stories, you were probably very angry and very frustrated, and you wanted to change society. Now, because of the popularity of McClures, all of its staff writers became celebrities for what they investigated and what they found out and how they wrote about it. But of all the writers for McClures, this is the one who I would like to talk about. Her name was Ida Tarbell. I will tell you that I have personally learned a lot about Ida Tarbell from the book The Bully Pulpit by the historian Doris Kearns Goodwin. That book gives a really good history of McClures Magazine and many of its writers, but then tells the story of Ida Tarbell really well. So if you're interested in the story of Ida Tarbell, the book is The Bully Pulpit by Doris Kearns Goodwin. So Ida Tarbell grew up in she grew up in Western Pennsylvania, and her dad was in the oil business, and her dad was driven out of business by, guess who, John D. Rockefeller. And so this created a little hardship for the family. But Ida Tarbell grows up. She becomes a young woman. She ended up going to Allegheny College, which is in northwestern Pennsylvania. It's a small little liberal arts school. While she was there, she helped to found the first Greek letter sorority for women, Kappa Alpha Theta. She did not really intend to go into investigative journalism, but she did want to become a writer. So she studied composition and literature. And then after graduating, she decided she wanted to leave the United States of America and go to the art capital of the world, Paris, France. And this was sort of her dream. She lived as a poor young person in the very hip and trendy left bank of Paris. So while she was there, she would have been rubbing elbows with some of the greatest writers of the late 19th century. And there were some English-speaking writers who were there in Paris at the time too. Guys like James Joyce from Ireland. She would have been living in Paris the same time he was living in Paris, writing his books. So she was mostly poor while she was living in Paris, but she did get a few things published. And these publications made their way back to the United States of America, where the readers of McClures Magazine, the staff of McClures Magazine read her work. They were intrigued by it, and they found out her background and that her family had suffered when she was a girl when her dad was put out of business by John D. Rockefeller. So they proffered an invitation to Ida Tarbell, asking her if she would like to be a staff writer for McClures and to use her dad and her family's connections in the oil business of Western Pennsylvania to write a muckraking piece on how John D. Rockefeller made all of his money. That was the offer. Ida Tarbell accepted. She moved from Paris, France to New York City. She began interviewing people who were familiar with John D. Rockefeller's business practices, both from within and outside of Standard Oil. And in 1904, in several installments, McClures Magazine published by Ida Tarbell the history of the Standard Oil Company. This particular piece of muckraking would inspire several politicians in the United States federal government to launch their own investigation of John D. Rockefeller and his business practices. And eventually, John D. Rockefeller would stand trial for violating the Sherman Antitrust Act, and his monopoly of Standard Oil would be broken up into multiple mutually competitive oil companies. And as you may know, this did nothing to hurt John D. Rockefeller's personal financial standing. Actually, when Standard Oil was broken up, Rockefeller simply invested in all of the other smaller companies and acquired more wealth. So it didn't really hurt him at all. But Ida Tarbell is our first muckraker that we're learning about. And hey, just for what it's worth, let me draw your attention to this. Several students of mine in the past have confused Ida Tarbell with Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells, if you remember, was also an investigative journalist. She's the individual who wrote Southern Horrors about lynching in the Deep South in the late 19th century. So just be careful not to mix up Ida Tarbell with Ida B. Wells. They have very similar names. And our next muckraker is this particular individual. He was a poor Dutch immigrant who lived in Manhattan. His name was Jacob Reese. As a young man, he was poor and he found himself homeless, but found a friend in the police who would allow him to come and sleep in an empty jail cell if they had it. So Jacob Reese developed a positive relationship with the police of Manhattan. Of course, it was the police who had the most direct contact with the poor, because it was in the poor, rough areas of Manhattan where there was significant crime and gang activity. Jacob Reese developed a fascination and an interest with the lives of the poor and dedicated his career to telling their story. So he would go on to write a book called How the Other Half Lives. This book was designed to pick the conscience of its readers by exposing them to how rough so many Americans have it in the late 19th century, so that they might be inspired to do something about it. Now, this book by Jacob Reese, How the Other Half Lives, is a book. You read about how the other half lives. But what made it so powerful is that it also included photographs. Now, photography had been around for several decades, and photography was continually improved throughout the 19th century. The original photographs that were taken in France back in the 1830s, I believe, these first photographs involved a copper plate that was pasted with all of these highly toxic chemicals. It was the plate was then slid inside the camera. It took a long time for the camera to absorb the light to make the impression on that copper plate to create the photograph. It was a very long and actually dangerous process. And then also to take the photographs, you had to have a lot of light. So there weren't photographs of anything indoors, and certainly no photographs of a darkened tenement room. But by the time Jacob Reese comes along, you have the development of flash photography. So you can now take pictures of darkened spaces. But this flash photography was a significant flash. It involved a significant flash. So the photographer would hold up the flash, press a button, that flash would create a little bit of a small explosion, a great illumination, and then when that happened, the camera took the picture. So what Jacob Reese is going to do is he's going to take his camera into the roughest areas of the Lower East Side of Manhattan in New York City to capture these images for all of America of how the destitute live. This is one of the most famous pictures of Jacob Reese. Actually, I don't know why I even say that. So many of Jacob Reese's photographs are incredibly famous and very powerful. This one's called Bandit's Roost. You're looking down an alleyway where gangsters rule the street. Jacob Reese also took pictures from inside of a tenement, where you have 6 men crowded together in 2 beds, and you get a strong sense of the griminess in which they live. And as you look at their faces, they're all squinting, at least those of them that are looking up at us. And of course they're squinting because of the massive flash that just emanated from the camera. Jacob Reese took pictures of poor people living in attics where they've stolen wood to burn to keep themselves warm. Pictures of immigrant families with next to no worldly possessions, not even a proper bed on which to sleep. Shacks, little shanty towns in which people lived. Children and the lives of children wandering around the street instead of being in school. People working in tenements, doing sewing and laundry. And then there's the plague of the urban poor, alcoholism. Jacob Reese was not afraid to take his flash photography and his camera into a darkened saloon to take pictures of people drinking, passed out on the floor. You have to remember that it was at this time that there was a growing temperance movement. The people involved in the temperance movement believed that alcohol needed to be banned, it needed to be prohibited. Alcohol should be illegal because of the social problems that it had stirred up beginning in the late 19th century, and specifically the problems that it caused for women and children. If a man got his paycheck after spending the week working in the factory, he might not take that money home, and that's precious little money that he's making in a factory. He might take it to the bar. He has 1 or 2 drinks, but once he gets drunk, he starts making poor decisions. He starts drinking a lot more, spends too much of his money, and that money doesn't make it home to his wife and children. His wife might get mad because he's drunk. He might get angry. He might be physically abusive to his wife and children. And so the temperance movement of the late 19th and early 20th century thought, well, just make alcohol illegal. If you make alcohol illegal, it will eliminate these social problems. And I'm certain that the images, the pictures provided by Jacob Reese helped support the temperance movement. Here's a picture of a man passed out. He's drunk and his friends are trying to get him up so that he can get to work. More tenements. A man living in the attic of a tenement. Children working in a tenement. A man sleeping in the basement of a building. Another man passed out on the floor of a bar. Another image of workers in a tenement. Another image of people living in the attic of a tenement. These were the photographs of Jacob Reese. Okay, so How the Other Half Lives was a very popular book. Many people read it. It was inspirational. It was a monumental book in the history of photography and raising consciousness of the lives of the poor. Sometimes images are more powerful than just the written word. But did anything come of this? Well, yes, but I can't talk about it here. This is not the last time I will talk about Jacob Reese and the influence of his book. You will learn a little bit more about Jacob Reese in the upcoming lecture on Theodore Roosevelt. All right, our next muckraker. Upton Sinclair was a writer who wrote a novel, a fictional story, about Lithuanian immigrants who came to the great city of Chicago who got work in a meat packing factory in Chicago. His goal in writing this book was to highlight the difficulties of immigrants and the horrible conditions in which they found themselves. But what ended up making this book so popular was the lurid description of what happened in a meat packing factory and all the stuff that went into the cans of meat that people bought in their local grocery stores. So in Chicago, the cattle would come in from the west. When they got to Chicago, the cattle would get slaughtered. And at this point in time in history, and we're talking the early 20th century now, there's no regulation, there's no health inspection, there are no codes, there are no standards, so the general conditions of the meatpacking plants were downright nasty. Allow me to read a very brief passage out of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle that describes the meat packing industry of the late 19th and early 20th century Chicago. He wrote, "It was too dark in these storage places to see well, but a man could run his hands over these piles of meat and sweep off handfuls of the dry dung of rats. These rats were nuisances, and the packers would put poisoned bread out for them. The rats would then die, and then the rats, the bread, and the meat would go into the hoppers all together." Now remember, this is a work of fiction. It's a novel. But Upton Sinclair had gathered the testimony of what life was actually like in a meatpacking factory in Chicago. And so the question went up with anybody who read this book, which was published in 1906, is this actually true? Because if it's true, then when we go to the grocery store and we get a can of hamburger, and we Americans love our hamburger, a lot of us eat hamburger, and we open up this can of meat, we might not just be eating hamburger meat. We might be eating rats. We might be eating rat crap. We might be eating poisoned bread. And this isn't good. Now, the irony was that when Upton Sinclair wrote this book, he wanted us to feel for the lives of the immigrant poor that were in Chicago and elsewhere around the United States and the hard lives that they lived. But as Upton Sinclair said in regards to his book, "I aimed at people's hearts, but I hit them in the stomach." People were just grossed out by this book. Now, one of the individuals who read this book when it came out in 1906 was the President of the United States, who was Theodore Roosevelt. We'll learn a lot more about Theodore Roosevelt later. But Theodore Roosevelt hired investigators to begin investigating meat packing plants to see if there was any truth in Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, and indeed there was. Many people look upon Theodore Roosevelt as a progressive president who did believe that it was the job of government to help protect Americans as a whole from unregulated business practices. Because there were no regulations in the late 19th, early 20th century, you could pretty much make and sell anything that you wanted to, and this had generated some anger and concern among people in the United States and some politicians like Theodore Roosevelt. So for example, you had what we call snake oil salesmen, people who would sell pharmaceuticals claiming that these drugs had amazing powers. So like, here's a vial of some syrup that can cure cancer if you drink it. Here's a drug that can cure blindness. So products that are making these wild and false claims, other products that people are buying that don't contain what they say they contain, such as when you buy hamburger meat and it's also got rat poison and rat crap in it, as well as maybe the rats themselves. And so what's to be done about this? So the next progressive that I get to talk about is not a writer, not a journalist, but rather a scientist. Harvey Wiley. Harvey Wiley was a chemist that was hired by Theodore Roosevelt to simply investigate what is in American food. Harvey Wiley was a Civil War veteran. He was originally from Indiana. He attended a very small liberal arts college in southern Indiana called Hanover College. By the dawn of the 20th century, Harvey Wiley was one of America's leading chemists. Theodore Roosevelt befriended him and asked him to research what was in American food. And that's all Harvey Wiley did for Theodore Roosevelt. Going to the grocery store, purchasing food, and then doing chemical analyses on the food to find out what exactly is in there. And sure enough, what Upton Sinclair was reporting in The Jungle was in fact true. Now Theodore Roosevelt has scientific evidence to press Congress to pass legislation to protect the American consumer. Now, one of the other things that Harvey Wiley did, which is very interesting, is he wanted to document the health effects of eating certain foods on the average person. So he accepted volunteers, these were mostly young men, to join what he called the Poison Squad. Essentially, these young men had to eat whatever Harvey Wiley put in front of them, because Harvey Wiley was personally curious of the effects that this particular food would have on the body. And so whatever he put in front of them, they ate, and he documented what happened to them after they ate it. These young men who were the volunteers for this elite group of brave eaters took particular pride in their volunteer work. They made a sign for themselves that said, "None but the brave can eat the fare." The Poison Squad actually, or excuse me, there's actually a fairly recent book published in the year 2018 called The Poison Squad, which is the story about Harvey Wiley and his volunteers. And the spirit of this recent book is that we still, in the 21st century, need more investigation into the food that we eat to find out what we are eating and the effects that it has on our body. Now, concerning this specific part of the story of progressivism, what I find amazing is just how swiftly the president and Congress acted. Very rarely do you have such a swift response. The Jungle by Upton Sinclair was published in the year 1906, and within a year, Theodore Roosevelt read the book, hired Harvey Wiley, who did all the research, who presented it to the president and to Congress, who responded with legislation before the end of the year. That's amazingly quick. So what happened? Well, the Food and Drug Association is created. And the Food and Drug Association, or the FDA, was created with a piece of legislation called the Pure Food and Drug Act. And the FDA evaluates the food that is sold in our grocery stores. The FDA requires that labels be placed on containers of food that specifically identify what ingredients are contained within. And the FDA, of course, can investigate the food to make sure that you are not lying on that particular label. So you start finding labels on food after 1906, and of course these labels are still on food today. And all of those things happened because Upton Sinclair wrote a book, and the president read the book and had a particular response. All right. Now, as I go back to talking about specific progressive reformers, this is probably the single most controversial one. Her name was Margaret Sanger. She grew up in New York City, the child of Irish Catholic immigrants, and she came from a very typical Irish Catholic family. Margaret Sanger had 10 brothers and sisters. Her dad was a loving man, but working all the time. Mom stayed at home, raising her 11 children, and ended up dying at the relatively young age of 50. And her mom's early death instilled in Margaret Sanger a sense that for most women who have many children, their lives are essentially controlled by their children. When all you do as a mom is take care of children all day, this ends up being a detriment to your social and emotional health, and actually can take a toll on your physical health as well. Margaret Sanger believed that her mom would have lived a lot longer than age 50 had she either not had so many children or if she could have had help with those children. Margaret Sanger, as an adult, becomes a social worker in New York City, where she works with a wide variety of poor women, and she continues to develop this perspective and now a desire to fight for the rights of women. So here's how Margaret Sanger took on this fight. Margaret Sanger believed that for women to be truly free, they needed to have control over their own reproductive systems. So now's when the story of Margaret Sanger starts to get controversial, because it involves sex and women's reproductive freedom. So some people can argue, if you don't want to have babies, then don't have sex. But Margaret Sanger didn't really see this as a realistic option, because as a social worker, the way she saw it was people are going to have sex whether you want them to or not. And it's a lot easier if you're a man because you're not the one who's going to carry the baby, and society doesn't expect for you to take care of a baby in the same way they expect a woman to take care of a baby. So as a man, if you have 11 babies or if you make 11 babies, you're still leaving the home, you're still going out, you're still working. You have to provide financially for the babies, but you still live this independent life outside of the home. Now, in terms of technological developments at this point in time in history, the early 20th century is when Margaret Sanger is around. Birth control is at least invented. The diaphragm was invented in the 1840s. Condoms were invented in the late 1860s. However, for both of those things, they were made illegal for moral reasons by the Comstock Act of 1872. Essentially, the argument with our federal legislature was that with birth control, and the availability of birth control, then they thought, and this was their reasoning, people would then start having more sex, which would somehow create a more immoral and degenerate society. They were trying to protect the notion that sex should only be something that happens between a man and a wife, and it should only be something that makes a baby. Now, that was Congress in 1872. For Margaret Sanger, a social worker in New York City in the early 20th century, she feels this is ridiculous. We have a problem that we need to solve pragmatically, and birth control is an easy way to stop this problem. Now, for Margaret Sanger, when she becomes a social worker, she takes on a much greater perspective than just her original concerns that she had for her mom. Margaret Sanger is looking at both women individually and society as a whole. And so for women individually, she wants to provide them with reproductive control over their own body so that they can have more freedom in life. So if you are a young woman and you're poor, it's not going to help you personally to have 5 babies. So having some reproductive control over your own body, that will help protect you socially, emotionally, financially, and probably physically. Okay, so there's that. And then there's society as a whole. Margaret Sanger looks at the population of poor people in the United States of America, and they are having more and more and more babies in the early 20th century. And these poor people cannot afford to take care of these babies, and so she believes and advocates for poor people not having as many babies. For her, this is just very scientific. And if you look at her perspective of things through the eyes of a social worker who's spending most of her day working with the poor in New York City, it would make sense that she would believe, hey, things would be a lot better for these poor people if they just didn't have as many children. Okay, so in general today, I mean, you can think about Margaret Sanger however you personally want to think about Margaret Sanger, but in general today, people who know about Margaret Sanger tend to respect her for her first perspective on women individually, but they don't like her for her perspective on society as a whole. And I'll get more into that here in just a moment. So in the year 1913, Margaret Sanger starts using the term birth control in relation to how women can achieve more freedom. Margaret Sanger started providing birth control to women via mail order, and she was arrested for that in 1915. And then she opened up her first birth control clinic, and she was arrested for that in 1916. She is intentionally breaking the law because she believes that this is necessary for the freedom of women and also to improve society as a whole. The name of the organization she started back in the 19-teens was called the American Birth Control League. In the year 1943, it was renamed, and it remains named Planned Parenthood. And Planned Parenthood still today remains dedicated to Margaret Sanger's original objective of providing women with health care and reproductive control. So this is for women individually to have more freedom. Now let's go back to Margaret Sanger's vision for society as a whole. When it comes to reproduction, in other words, people making babies, Margaret Sanger joined a growing international movement that advocated for only healthy and financially stable people to have babies, and that the poor and or physically or mentally unhealthy people not having babies, and even making it a requirement for some people identified as not being good parents by society, however that process of identification would occur, to being surgically neutered so that they cannot have babies. So here, Margaret Sanger becomes very controversial. This movement was called eugenics. Eugenics is a Greek word. The prefix EU means good, like euphoria when you feel really good. And genetics obviously refers to genes, so good genes. And there was this idea that we could create an amazing society in the future if only strong, healthy, mentally stable, and financially stable people made babies. And if the poor, the mentally disabled, the physically disabled, if they were prevented from having babies, then we'd have a future society of super people. and that as a whole would be good for the country. And the eugenics movement was big in the United States of America. And Margaret Sanger was one of the most visible advocates for the eugenics movement in the United States of America. Now, the eugenics movement in the United States of America dies out after World War II because the biggest advocate for the worldwide eugenics movement was Adolf Hitler, who implemented eugenics in Nazi Germany. So literally tens of thousands of people with a mental disability or a physical disability were executed by Adolf Hitler, and in Nazi youth camps, those girls and those boys that were identified as being physically strong and beautiful were quite literally asked to breed. They were told to have sex and make babies. So after we fought the Nazis in World War II, eugenics as a movement dies out in the United States of America. But in the early 20th century, it was here, and Margaret Sanger was one of its spokespeople. As she said in 1921, the most urgent problem today is how to limit and discourage the over-fertility of the mentally and physically defective. Okay, so hopefully you're getting a very clear sense of how Margaret Sanger is a controversial individual who was a progressive in the early 20th century. But it doesn't end here. As Margaret Sanger looked at the poor and those that were identified as mentally and physically defective, she saw among that population a disproportionate number of African Americans. So, racist organizations in the United States of America begin embracing Margaret Sanger, saying, yes, fewer African Americans should have babies. So go figure, Margaret Sanger draws the attention of the Ku Klux Klan. And they invite Margaret Sanger to come and speak at some of their KKK rallies. And she does. Here's what she had to say. I accepted an invitation to talk to the women's branch of the Ku Klux Klan. I saw through the door dim figures parading with banners and illuminated crosses. I was escorted to the platform, was introduced, and began to speak. In the end, through simple illustrations, I believed I had accomplished my purpose. A dozen invitations to speak to similar groups were proffered. And that is the story of the very controversial progressive of the early 20th century, Margaret Sanger. And now let us talk about somebody completely different. If you are able to look at your screen right now, you will see one of the most beautiful vistas in all of the United States of America. Perched on top of the Sierra Mountains in central California is this, Yosemite Valley. And it is in Yosemite Valley, in all of its natural splendor, that we have the emergence of our next great progressive. His name was John Muir. From childhood on, John Muir led an incredible life. His childhood and his background help us to understand the type of progressive he would become as an adult man, and I'm going to give that to you in some depth right here, right now. John Muir was born in Scotland, but as a young boy was brought to the United States of America, so he is an immigrant. His dad got a farm in rural Wisconsin, where he homeschooled John Muir in a very strict religious upbringing. Part of the reason why John Muir was raised by his dad in the middle of nowhere, Wisconsin, was because his dad did not trust society, was trying to get away from it all, and to protect his family from the evils of the world. To give you a sense of how John Muir was raised, he was expected to memorize full passages from the Bible. So in the morning, his dad would say, I want you to memorize this page of the Bible. And then his dad would go off and work. At the end of the day, he would ask John to recite from memory that page from the Bible. And if John couldn't do it, he was beaten. In the end, John Muir, as a young man, had memorized the entire New Testament of the Bible and 3/4 of the Old Testament of the Bible. We're talking of about thousands of pages that John Muir could recite on cue. So even as a young man, this guy has an amazing brain. But he's also growing up in the middle of nowhere, rural Wisconsin. As a young boy, on a farm, without much social interaction, he falls in love with nature. John Muir is also one of the only pacifist draft dodgers that I know about from the Civil War. When the Civil War broke out, he did not want to fight. So he literally just went up north to Canada and spent the duration of the Civil War living up in Canada. And at that time, exploring nature, identifying flowers in Canada. I don't really know much about what John Muir thought about the Union cause or at the time how he felt about slavery. I think just as a young man, he didn't want to shoulder a gun. But then sometime after the war, he's back in the United States of America and he gets a job working in a bicycle factory in Indianapolis, Indiana. And it is in this factory that an accident happens to him. Now, I'm going to describe this accident, and this may be difficult for you to listen to because it was very difficult for me to read about when I first learned John Muir's story. And what makes it difficult is it involves an eyeball injury. Most of us, like me, are very sensitive with our eyes. But understand this, if you decide to listen to this story, which I'll tell over the course of the next minute, it has a happy ending. It has a very happy ending, and his eyes are all okay at the end. So the accident happened like this. A sharp object got loose, it flung through the air, it struck John Muir in the eye, and it pierced his eyeball. The vitreous fluid inside of his eyeball began leaking out, and he lost sight in that eye. And that eye was bandaged up. But because of the shock of that one eye, the other eye went blind too, just out of shock. So John Muir goes completely blind. Okay, so that was the accident. It's horrible. It's awful. I know. It makes me flinch too. I'm very sensitive with my eyes too. Okay, but here's what's incredible. The eyeball and the outer membranes of an eyeball are just like your skin. When your skin gets punctured or when your skin gets scratched, it bleeds. But eventually then it scabs and it heals up and everything's okay. It goes back to being normal and your eyeball can function in the exact same way. John Muir's eyeball healed and the vitreous fluid eventually filled back up in the eyeball. And after a certain period of time, I don't know exactly how long, a few weeks I would assume, he could see again. He could see again. And this is the happy ending of this story. Not only can he see again after thinking he was going to be blind for the rest of his life, he has a spiritual awakening. And he looks at things, and hopefully you can understand this, after thinking you're going to go blind, he looks at things afresh for the first time. And he doesn't take it for granted, like you and I might take something for granted. So when he sees a tree again, he's overcome by the awesome beauty of a tree. And this love that he had cultivated for the natural world as a young boy, it hits him full force. And he decides, after having this spiritual awakening of being able to see nature, that he is going to quit his job and spend the rest of his life, as John Muir would say, living someplace wild. He just wants to go into nature and spend the rest of his life living in nature. All right, so what's he do? Well, John Muir lives a life in the late 19th century and into the early 20th century that I don't think many of us today can really understand or even explain. The constitution of his body, this guy is just tough. And the way he lived his life, I honestly don't think that many of us could live like this right now. We would become physically ill and we'd probably go mentally insane if we tried to live like John Muir. But here's what he said he did. Starting off in Indianapolis, Indiana, he got a backpack. He filled his backpack with tea, crackers, and a journal to write in. And that was it. And then he wanted to go visit the rainforest in South America, so he decides to walk to the rainforest. Now, he doesn't make it to the rainforest, and I have to explain what happened, but he said, I just jumped over my back fence, and this is what John Muir wrote. To what degree we can trust it, like this is all that's in his backpack and what he did, but he just said, I jumped over my back fence and I just started walking. Now, if you decided to run away from home and just left home with this same amount of stuff in your backpack and started walking, how far are you going to get it? How far are you going to get before you finally decide, this isn't worth it. I'm going to turn around. I'm going to go home. You know, bad weather at the very least is going to hit you pretty soon. How are you going to respond to that? But John Muir literally walked not to South America, but he did make it to the Gulf of Mexico. He called it my 1,000-mile walk to the sea, stopping along the way to sleep out in nature and to scavenge whatever food he could find. Now, could you do that? Could you walk from Columbus, Ohio to the Gulf of Mexico? See, that's right away, this is where John Muir is a very different type of human being than most of us. So when he got to the Gulf of Mexico, he caught a boat to take him to South America, but he got sick, he got the flu, and so he stops in Mexico, decides that instead of continuing south to the rainforest in Brazil, he's going to walk across Mexico, which he does, and gets to the Pacific Ocean, catches another boat that takes him up north, and he makes it as far as San Francisco, California. And from here on out, the story of California and the story of John Muir become intertwined. Now, San Francisco is a very big, growing, vibrant city that's been developing since the 1849 gold rush. Most of the people who come to California are there looking for jobs, they're looking for money. John Muir, supposedly, when he gets off the boat, goes around town asking where he can go that's wild, that he just wanted to go someplace wild. And he was instructed to go to a region called Yosemite. Now, if you want to go to Yosemite today, here's what you are most likely going to do. You're first of all going to catch a plane from Columbus, Ohio to San Francisco. From San Francisco, then, you're going to get in a car and you're going to drive east into the mountains of California. And here's what that drive is going to be like. It's going to take you, I forget, about an hour and a half to 2 hours to get to the mountains. And then once you hit those mountains, look out. You're going to spend a half an hour going up this switchback road. If you're afraid of heights, this is not a happy drive for you. And if you actually do the driving, it's a bit of a white knuckle drive because the road is built on the side of a mountain range and you're going up and up and up and up. And you look down and it's like, whoo, it's quite a fall down. Okay, so then you make that drive up. So you're on the top of a mountain range. And when you get to the top of that drive, there's a restaurant and restrooms for many people who need to make a stop at that particular point of time. But then you drive into the mountains. Now you've already summited to the top of the Sierra mountain range. And now you're continuing to drive east, and you drive east for another, I don't know, I can't remember times exactly, but about another 45 minutes. And then you hit Yosemite and you see this. You see mountains, huge mountains on either side of this valley. You see famous iconic formations like Half Dome, like El Capitan. And these already huge mountains are sitting on top of a mountain range. So the best way I can describe Yosemite is they are mountains on top of mountains. And you are already really high up in the air. It's a stunning sight. It's absolutely beautiful. If you love nature, you have to go to Yosemite at some point in time in your life. Most of you will fly to San Francisco and then drive to Yosemite if you do this. Understand that John Muir walked from San Francisco into Yosemite. And when he saw it, he fell in love with it. And he said, this is it. I'm going to spend the rest of my life living here. He got a job building and working at a very small hotel for tourists, which enabled him to make enough money and provided him with the means to survive and to continue to live in Yosemite. He built his own home. I really wish I could see this home. I don't think it exists anymore. But he wanted to be as close to nature as possible, so he literally built it over a creek so that he would be able to sleep in a bed in a home, and it's really small, I'm sure it was a small, humble little shack that was built over a creek, so he would constantly have a babbling brook next to him. So hopefully you're getting a sense of what John Muir is like. On his days off, he would do the most incredible thing, or things actually. He would go hiking, he would go climbing, and he did extraordinarily dangerous things. He does not have modern hiking gear. He literally has his hands, and he drove a few nails through the bottom of his boots so he could get a better grip. And he would do things like climb up behind waterfalls. And what he did was extraordinarily dangerous. Other things that he did, he wanted to know what it was like to be a tree during a thunderstorm. So when a thunderstorm happened, he goes outside and he climbs up to the top of the tree, and the tree is, of course, swaying back and forth, and he's, dozens of feet off the ground, enjoying what it must be like to be a tree in a thunderstorm. while he was out hiking one day, he came across a bear, and he wonders what it's like to have a bear charge him. So what he does is he makes himself really big. He throws his hands out. I could never do this. I think this is just insane. He throws his hands out and he charges the bear, screaming, waving his hands around, because he wants to see what it's like to have a bear approach him really quickly. So he's just going to approach the bear really quickly. Now, fortunately for John Muir, the bear just kind of like looked quizzically at him, turned and walked away. But this is John Muir. John Muir is an individual who found complete rapture in nature. It seems like this sense of just being overcome by the beauty and the power of nature and all of the animals and the trees and the rivers and the mountains and everything. The pure bliss and pleasure of experiencing all that overrode in John Muir any sense of fear or concern for himself, his desire to make money, his livelihood, his physical well-being, anything. John Muir was just this religious ecstatic. I think some people hear the story of John Muir and are inspired by it, like, wow, I wish I could live like that. But to actually live like that is something else. So if you like to hike, and I like to hike, I'm inspired by John Muir's story, and you probably would be inspired by John Muir's story too. But there's something about John Muir that's also incredibly annoying if you're a normal human being, because if you go out for a hike for a few hours, you get tired, you get hungry, you spend a couple days out in nature. I mean, you get grimy. You're just aching for like a hot cup of coffee and a warm shower and a soft bed. And that's what we're like today. That's how our bodies are wired. And John Muir could be out there for days. And he didn't have polysynthetic clothing like we have. He wore cotton clothes and wool clothes. I mean, that's what he had. If it rained on him, he's going to be soaking wet for a long time. And it didn't bother him. And I don't know how this man survived on the little food that he did. He wrote a book about his experience going to Alaska later on. He traveled to Alaska several times, and he talked about how he'd wake up in the morning and he would put in his backpack a cracker. Now, I'd assume this was a big block of a cracker, but he's put in his backpack a cracker and then, of course, tea. It seems to be what he subsisted on. And then in his journal, he talked about how he'd get up in the morning, hike 12 miles, hiking 12 miles. And he's not hiking on a path. There's no trail here. So he's essentially making his own way on an unblazed trail, or there's no trail, makes it 12 miles. This is going to take several hours. And then he stops to have a breakfast of a cracker and some tea. I just don't get that. I do not know how he did it. But this is John Muir. Okay. So how does this reclusive, nature-loving hermit influence the history of the United States of America? All right, well, let's learn about that. Here's another picture of Yosemite if you're looking at your screen. Here's another picture of Yosemite if you're looking at your screen. Here's Half Dome. And then here is John Muir's favorite place in Yosemite. If you're able to look at your screen right now, I would encourage you to do this, because it certainly is a beautiful sight. Of course, a black and white photograph from the early 20th century doesn't do it much justice, but hopefully you can get a sense of what an amazing sight it is. This is Hetch Hetchy Valley. So you see this river that flows through the valley. You see the rock formations on either side, and if you look closely, there are multiple waterfalls that flow over the rock formations and then down into Hetch Hetchy Valley. It's beautiful, and it's hopefully easy to understand why John Muir would have a love affair with this particular place in the greater Yosemite region. And it was John Muir's love affair for Hetch Hetchy that will catapult him into being not just this nature-loving hermit, but a major player in American history. Because here is the plan for Hetch Hetchy. The city of San Francisco is growing. In order to accommodate the growing population of San Francisco, more fresh water is needed. San Francisco is like any city in the western part of the United States of America. Its growth required a lot of civic planning and and getting fresh water into the city for a growing population to sustain that growing population. In that way, San Francisco is no different from Los Angeles, Las Vegas, Phoenix, whatever. So the local government of San Francisco develops a plan to dam Hetch Hetchy. So to build to build a dam on that beautiful river that you just saw, flood out that valley, and then pipe the water from Hetch Hetchy all the way into San Francisco, thus providing the people of San Francisco with fresh water. Now, if you are a resident of San Francisco who has no connection to Yosemite or Hetch Hetchy Valley, yeah, sure, sounds great, right? If we don't get more fresh water pumped into San Francisco, then water is going to become more expensive. It's going to be more difficult to build more housing developments. If we want San Francisco to continue to grow and the people here to be happy, we need to get more fresh water into San Francisco. It's simple enough. So word reaches Yosemite that the city of San Francisco is planning on building a dam in Hetch Hetchy Valley. And John Muir expectedly does not want this to happen at all, and he decides to put up a fight. So he begins writing politicians. He begins contacting other people who might be willing to stand up for protecting Hetch Hetchy. John Muir tries to make the case that we need to protect Hetch Hetchy for its value as being a natural, beautiful place. And that is a hard argument to make. The City Council of San Francisco says, we want to grow, we want to develop, we want our people to be happy, we want to make more money. That argument carries weight. What's John Muir's argument? No, you shouldn't do these things because we need to protect Hetch Hetchy because it's pretty, because it makes us feel good to walk into this wild, beautiful, natural area that's uncorrupted with the hand of man, or by the hand of man. For many people in the late 19th, early 20th century, and still today, that argument that John Muir is trying to make sounds a little kooky. Wait, you want to stop the development of San Francisco just to protect an area that you think is pretty? No, we're trying to survive as a city here. But then there are many people who understand John Muir's perspective. What John Muir wants to do is create a park. And there are many of us who appreciate parks, wild areas, a place where you can escape from the city to go and to walk next to a beautiful river, see beautiful waterfalls, see wildlife, that there's something important in having that. And that is what John Muir is going to fight for throughout the remainder of his life. Okay, so what happened with Hetch Hetchy? Well, in the year 1906, one of the worst earthquakes in American history happened in San Francisco. The famous San Francisco earthquake of 1906 caused massive destruction and loss of life in San Francisco. The individuals who wanted to build the dam in Hetch Hetchy used the San Francisco earthquake as ammunition for their cause. They made the claim that was erroneous, it was a lie, but they didn't care, they still made the claim that had there been more fresh water available to the city of San Francisco, that the fires produced by the earthquake could have been put out more quickly, and there would have been less damage. And because after the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco, there was truly a spirit of we need to rebuild San Francisco and make it a better, safer city, and do our very best to prevent future tragedies like this from ever happening again, this helped push enough legislators to approve the construction of a dam in the Hetch Hetchy Valley and for water to be piped from Yosemite into San Francisco. So if you go to Hetch Hetchy today, this is what you see. The valley is gone, it's all dammed up. There still is a very nice trail that goes along the perimeter of this reservoir, but certainly it is not what John Muir experienced in the early 20th century. And it's developments like these that John Muir dedicates himself to fighting for the rest of his life. John Muir plays this very important role at the end of the 19th and early 20th century, at a time when the historian Frederick Jackson Turner proclaimed that there was no more frontier left, and American civilization was springing up everywhere from sea to shining sea. John Muir plays this important role in drawing our attention to the conservation of natural resources. He raises our awareness that this boundless land full of trees and mountains and rivers, wildlife, plants, minerals, all of this stuff, we can actually use it all up. And now the time has come to begin the process of protecting some of it. Now, to get this point across, he's going to have to fight for it. Because most Americans at the dawn of the 20th century have the same general attitude that their grandparents had, that there's enough out there for everybody, for anybody. So cut down those trees. Don't worry about pouring sewage into a river. Go and kill as many bison as you want to kill. Doesn't matter. America's so big and so boundless. You can never use it all up. And John Muir begins advocating, yes, you can use it all up. Yes, you can destroy this environment. And we need to think about future generations and preserving some of this country as it originally was for future Americans. And John Muir encouraged people not to be naive about anything. He had this phrase, "Nothing tolerable is safe," to express this idea. Think of it like this. The largest living creature on the planet is a sequoia tree. Sequoia trees, tallest living thing on Earth. They're tall, they're majestic, and they are ancient. Some of them are over 2,000 years old. So if you visit California and you come across a large sequoia, you can think to yourself, that tree was alive when Jesus was alive. And it might even be older than that. And yet, here it still is, alive today. And you might think, oh, that's so incredible, that's so beautiful, it's so tall and majestic. Nobody would ever want to take a chainsaw to that tree and in a few moments just destroy it. But John Muir tries to remind us, nothing tolerable is safe. It doesn't matter how beautiful you think something is. Somebody who's like, I got a chainsaw, I could cut this tree down and I could sell the wood and I could make a mountain of money. That financial motivation is going to encourage destruction. So here we are, and this is what makes John Muir a progressive. If all we have is unbridled capitalism and a desire to make money, we're going to destroy nature. And what's the only organization in the United States of America that could stop companies from sending their lumberjacks into the forests of sequoias and redwoods? Of course, that only organization is the United States government. So John Muir establishes an organization, a club. This club is called the Sierra Club. Its logo features an image from, go figure, Yosemite Valley. The Sierra Club is funded mostly by donations, and the Sierra Club is political. The members of the Sierra Club write politicians to encourage them to protect the natural areas of the United States of America. The members of the Sierra Club also do their best to educate Americans as a whole about the current state of the natural world in the United States. So, for example, animals that might be near extinction, parks that are being threatened by development. These are things that the Sierra Club tries to make politicians and Americans as a whole aware of. And of course, they try to do their best to protect and preserve nature. Now, that is the organization that John Muir started. And because of that particular organization and the works of John Muir personally brought a lot of attention to the natural world through his writings. He is a very eloquent nature writer, and his story as an individual, his biography is so amazing that people wanted to read about it. It's because of his influence that a national park system was developed in the early 20th century. And the goal of the National Park Service is to protect natural and historic areas, to conserve them as they were, as best as they possibly can for future generations. Now, this is hard because, you take an area like Yosemite, for example, you want to make sure that Yosemite looks exactly like it did back in John Muir's time, or as it did 1,000 years ago for future generations. But at the same time, you want to invite people in to see it. So when you invite people in, there's hotels, restrooms, restaurants, bathrooms. You have to have some infrastructure for that. So you have to tamper with nature a little bit, and the National Park Service has to kind of work on striking this fine balance. The NPS was officially established in the year 1916, so it's a little over 100 years old. Our first official national park is Yellowstone, which is a gigantic park that lies mostly within the state of Wyoming. There's the iconic geyser, Old Faithful, Yellowstone. A lot of people, including me, mix up those two big national parks that both begin with the letter Y, Yellowstone and Yosemite. But John Muir, the National Park System, the Sierra Club, they all represent this progressive movement that we need to increase the size and the scope and the power of the United States federal government to protect the people, and in this case, to protect nature from big businesses, corporations, and other people who see the opportunity to make a profit. Another federal organization that develops around the same time as the National Park Service is the United States Forest Service. Now, I think a lot of Americans hear, well, National Park Service, National Forest Service, and they think it's pretty much the same thing, but there's actually a pretty interesting difference between them. First of all, the National Park Service is part of the Department of the Interior. That's the part of the federal government which protects America's natural resources and heritage. And then the U.S. Forest Service is part of the Department of Agriculture. So you hear agriculture, you think farming, right? And so the mission of the Forest Service is slightly different from the mission of the Park Service. Now, the very first head of the United States Forest Service was this particular individual, Gifford Pinchot. And Pinchot was a nature lover just like John Muir, with also a very interesting background. But I'm not going to get into Pinchot's background as much as John Muir. He was not much of a nature ecstatic like John Muir was, but he certainly spent a lot of time in nature, and he certainly loved nature. So don't forget that as you hear this story of the National Forest Service. Gifford Pinchot, different from John Muir though, in that Gifford Pinchot wanted to balance out the protection of natural areas with the development of the United States of America. So whereas John Muir, if John Muir thought of a tree, he'd say, oh, a tree, it's beautiful, let's protect it, let's keep it here forever, never cut down a tree. Gifford Pinchot, on the other hand, would say, well, but we need trees, we need lumber, we need paper, we need to build houses. You know, we're going to have to cut down trees. So how about if we do this? Let's create national forests. And part of these national forests will preserve the trees, where in some of these areas of the forest, we have images like this, where we cut down the trees. And then after we cut down the trees, we plant new trees and we grow more trees for the future. And then throughout the national forest, we sort of circulate the areas where we cut down trees and then plant new ones to grow in their place. That way, we're constantly harvesting trees in this sustainable way. We don't just say, oh, we're not cutting down any trees anymore, but rather we acknowledge that we need trees for development, and so we manage the harvesting of trees. So that made Gifford Pinchot different from John Muir. But also Gifford Pinchot had another issue with trees and with cutting down trees, and that was forest fires. And if you think of the Forest Service, the big icon for the Forest Service is Smokey the Bear. You may have seen Smokey the Bear and how he says, only you can prevent forest fires. Okay, so that's the National Forest Service. Because Gifford Pinchot understood that forest fires happen when you have an old forest. It's part of nature's way of sort of clearing things out and starting things new. But forest fires, as we know, can threaten communities. It can threaten cities. So wouldn't it be great to prevent those forest fires? So the Forest Service can do this by cutting down trees in particular places at particular times and sparing as many people as possible from forest fires. Okay, so here are our two nature lovers with their two different philosophies. John Muir is typically considered to be a conservationist. Gifford Pinchot is labeled a preservationist. And these two organizations in the United States federal government that reflect these two slightly different philosophies. The National Park Service is conservationist. The U.S. Forest Service is preservationist. If you are interested in local nearby National Park Service sites and local National Forest sites, here in Ohio, there are quite a few. There are 13 national parks in the state of Ohio, 16 national forests in the state of Ohio. The biggest national park is the Cuyahoga Valley National Park, which is south of Cleveland. Most of the other national park sites in Ohio are more historical sites. And then the only national forest that I know of in Ohio is the Wayne National Forest, which is in southeastern Ohio. So if you go into Hocking Hills, you'll find the Wayne National Forest down there. And the Wayne National Forest is broken up. It's, as you see from this map, if you're looking at this map right now, it's not just one continual forest. It's, broken up. And you go into Wayne National Forest, there's some beautiful, beautiful areas that, you feel like, wow, I'm deep into the woods here. But then you'll come across large stretches where the trees have been cut down. And you remember, oh yeah, I'm in a national forest, not in a national park. But you go up north to Cuyahoga Valley National Park. Cuyahoga Valley is not Yosemite or Yellowstone, but there are quite a few areas still that you can go into and be, deep in the woods and look around and you can think, yeah, this is what Ohio looked like 20,000 years ago. And maybe you can have yourself a John Muir moment. All right, so we've learned about several progressives. And remember, the big idea of the progressive movement is this. In the late 19th century, huge corporations and super powerful, wealthy industrialists developed. This country was being controlled by a handful of rich people. And the progressives believed that the only way to return to a more fair, equitable democracy was to empower the government, to strengthen the federal government, to be able to place checks on those wealthy industrialists and their companies, to not let them just, for example, sell us food that we think is just hamburger meat, but in fact it's got ground up rats and dogs and poo in it. The government should be empowered to do that, to stop those companies from selling us that food. That really isn't food. Who's going to save our natural resources? Well, only government has the power to do that. Let's empower the government to do that. The progressive movement came to a head in the late 19-teens when this Democrat became president of the United States. His name was Woodrow Wilson, and he pressed for many progressive legislative reforms. And we sort of many historians mark Woodrow Wilson as the culmination of the entire progressive movement. But there was another president prior to Woodrow Wilson who also made many progressive reforms. And we will learn about both of these presidents in a later lecture. That's it for this lecture on the Populists and the Progressives. I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed the learning. Hey guys, have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.